The heavy oak door of Finch's Highway Diner rattled on its hinges as a gust of wind swept down the desolate mountain pass. Outside, a late November snowstorm was in full force, transforming the pine trees of Oak Ridge, Vermont, into jagged white shadows. Inside, the diner was a refuge of warm, yellow light, the smell of grease, toasted bread, and cheap coffee. Mabel Finch stood behind the counter, a worn rag in her hand, mindlessly rubbing at a faded coffee stain. She wasn't really focused on the wood. Her eyes were trained on the far corner booth. Sitting in that booth, beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed a low, mechanical tune, was Lucas Cole. He was 32, but his face carried the quiet, weathered look of a man who had worked twice as many years as he had lived. His hands, scarred and calloused from long hours at the local lumber yard and part-time shifts at the town's auto shop, were wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. Across from him sat his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. She was a small, bright-eyed girl with wild curls that refused to stay pinned back. She wore a hand-knitted green sweater that was slightly too short at the wrists, revealing a pair of mismatched mittens resting on the laminate table. Between them sat a single, white ceramic plate. On it was a stack of 3 pancakes, cut carefully into perfectly equal portions. Beside the plate was a small, half-empty paper cup of maple syrup. "Go ahead, sweetie," Lucas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried an immense, unspoken tenderness. He pushed the plate closer to Lily. "Eat the middle piece. That's the warmest one." "But Daddy," Lily whispered, looking up at him with wide, serious eyes, "you only had a piece of toast this morning. We should split it even Steven." Lucas smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. He gently tapped her nose with a rough finger. "My stomach is twice the size of yours, which means it takes a lot more to fill it up. I'm waiting for a bigger meal later. You eat. You need the energy for school tomorrow." Lily looked at him, not entirely believing him, but she slowly picked up her fork and took a small bite. Before she could swallow, the diner's front door flew open. A blast of freezing air swept across the linoleum floor, causing the few patrons, 2 long-haul truck drivers and an elderly local named Otis, to shiver and pull their collars tight. A man stepped in first. He wore a sharp, tailored charcoal overcoat, a cashmere scarf, and leather gloves that looked like they had never touched dirt. His hair was perfectly parted, defying the wind outside. This was Carter Hayes. He scanned the diner with an expression of deep, immediate distaste, as if he had just stepped into a dusty cellar. "Victoria, please," Carter said, turning back toward the doorway, his voice sharp with professional panic. "The car is running. The driver can have us at the resort in 20 minutes. There is absolutely no reason to stop here. The press pool is already setting up at the venue." But the woman who stepped in behind him wasn't listening. Victoria Sterling, the 34-year-old tech billionaire and founder of the Sterling Education Initiative, stood in the doorway. She wore a long, camel-colored coat that was damp with melting snow. Her dark hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and her face, usually so composed on the covers of business magazines, looked exhausted. It was a deep, soul-weary tiredness that no amount of money could hide. She didn't look at Carter. Her eyes swept past the greasy counter, past the spinning stools, and landed on the very back of the diner. "I need a moment of quiet, Carter," Victoria said, her voice cool and commanding, yet carrying a fragile undertone. "The noise in the car was giving me a headache, and I'm hungry. We have a private catering team waiting at the lodge," Carter hissed, stepping closer to her, lowering his voice so the truck drivers wouldn't hear. "A national campaign launch is tonight. You are the face of a $20 billion foundation. You cannot be seen eating diner food in the middle of nowhere. Think of the optics." Victoria didn't answer. She walked forward, her designer boots clicking softly against the worn floor. She didn't look at the television mounted above the pie display, which was currently playing a local news broadcast showing her own face beneath the headline. "Billionaire philanthropist Victoria Sterling arrives in Vermont for gala." She walked straight toward the back booth. Lucas Cole didn't look up immediately. He was busy wiping a stray drop of syrup from Lily's chin with a paper napkin. He didn't care about the expensive coats or the tense argument near the door. To him, the storm outside was just another thing he would have to shovel around in the morning. "Mind if I join you?" The voice was soft, striking, and entirely out of place in Finch's highway diner. Lucas paused, the napkin still in his hand. He looked up slowly. He didn't see a billionaire. He didn't see a powerful tech mogul whose name was spoken in congressional hearings. He simply saw a woman standing in wet shoes, with snow melting on her shoulders, looking incredibly lonely. "Victoria," Carter said, catching up to her, his face pale with embarrassment. "There is a private booth in the back corner near the kitchen, where we can ask these people to—" "I asked the gentleman," Victoria interrupted, her eyes locked on Lucas. Lucas looked at the empty vinyl seat across from him and Lily. Then he looked at Victoria's damp shoes. "It's just a piece of plastic," Lucas said calmly. "Sit if you're cold." Before Victoria could move, Lily slid quickly to the inside of the booth, pulling her small drawing pad close to her chest. She looked up at Victoria with a bright, welcoming smile. "You can sit here," Lily said, her voice clear and sweet. "My mom used to say that lonely people should never have to eat by themselves." Victoria froze. For a fraction of a second, the poised, impenetrable billionaire looked as though a child had gently touched a deep, unhealed wound in her heart. She blinked, swallowing hard, before slowly sliding into the booth. She sat down carefully, treating the cracked red vinyl with more respect than she did the leather seats of her private jet. Carter stood beside the table, looking as though he might faint. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, pulling out his phone. "I will be outside. We leave in 15 minutes, Victoria." "Exactly 15. No one answered him. Carter turned on his heel and walked toward the front of the diner, muttering into his phone. Mabel Finch slowly walked over, a fresh pot of coffee in her hand. Her eyes darted between Victoria and Lucas, her maternal instinct telling her to stay quiet. She poured a steaming mug for Victoria, then topped off Lucas's cup. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" Mabel asked softly. "Just the coffee." "Thank you," Victoria said, her hands immediately wrapping around the warm ceramic mug. She didn't realize how badly her fingers were shaking until she felt the heat of the cup. Lucas pushed the plate of pancakes slightly toward the middle of the table. "We only ordered one plate," Lucas said, his voice entirely devoid of shame or pretense. "But there's enough if you don't mind taking smaller bites." Victoria looked at the cut-up pancakes, then at the worn cuffs of Lucas's jacket. She saw the rough, scarred knuckles of his hands that looked like they had fought for every dollar they ever held. Yet there was a profound, unshakable dignity in his eyes. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I wouldn't want to take from your daughter." "Lily is happy to share," Lucas said gently, nodding at his daughter. "Aren't you, Lil?" "Yep," Lily said proudly. She took her fork and pushed a piece of pancake toward Victoria. "It has the most syrup on it." Victoria took the extra fork Mabel had left on the table. She lifted the small bite of pancake to her mouth and ate it. It was simple, sweet, and tasted entirely of a home she had never really known. As she ate, her eyes fell on the small, rusted blue tin box sitting on the edge of the table next to Lily's drawing pad. The box had faded painted daisies on the lid, the metal worn silver at the corners. For some reason, the sight of that dented little box made Victoria's heart skip a beat. It looked ancient, loved, and heavily guarded. She forced her eyes away, looking back at the man sitting across from her. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet, working-class father she was sharing a cheap diner breakfast with was the very reason she had the eyes to see him at all. The silence inside the diner was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a fork against a plate. At the counter, Mabel Finch was still pretending to clean, but her ears were tuned to the back booth. She had known Lucas since he was a boy. She knew the depth of his struggles, the long nights he spent working, and the quiet grace with which he carried his grief. To see him sitting across from a woman worth billions was surreal. Yet Lucas behaved as if she were just another neighbor seeking shelter from the storm. Victoria took another slow sip of her coffee. The warmth was returning to her fingers, but the tension in her chest remained. "You don't have a coat," Victoria observed softly, looking at Lucas's simple flannel shirt. His worn canvas jacket was draped over the back of the booth, the cuffs frayed and thin. "I have one," Lucas replied, pointing to the draped jacket. "It does the job." "It looks cold," Victoria said. "Cold is just a state of mind," Lucas said with a faint smile. "You get used to it when you have to." "My dad is the strongest man in the whole town," Lily chimed in, her mouth full of pancake. "He can lift a whole log by himself, and he never gets cold." "Is that so?" Victoria smiled, a genuine, soft expression that she rarely allowed her public relations team to see. "He sounds like a superhero." "He is," Lily said seriously. Carter Hayes suddenly re-entered the diner, the cold wind following him like an annoying shadow. He marched back to the booth, his phone in hand, his face tight with irritation. "Victoria, the local mayor is already at the hotel. The press is asking why your car was spotted on the highway. We need to go. Now." Victoria didn't look up from her coffee. "The storm is getting worse, Carter. It isn't safe to drive fast anyway. Tell them I will be there shortly." "This is a national campaign, Victoria," Carter pressed, his voice rising slightly, attracting a sharp look from Mabel behind the counter. "We are launching the Sterling Education Initiative in this region. We cannot have the lead donor and founder late because she's sitting in A." He looked at Lucas and Lily, his eyes lingering on the single plate of pancakes. "In a place like this," Lucas slowly set his coffee mug down. The sound of the heavy ceramic hitting the laminate table was quiet, but it carried an undeniable weight. "The road up the pass is icing over," Lucas said, his voice calm, steady, and entirely level. "If you try to rush a heavy sedan up that hill right now, you'll slide off the shoulder into the ravine. The highway Sanders won't be out for another hour." Carter looked at Lucas, his lip curling slightly. "And I suppose you're a traffic expert, mister?" "Lucas," he replied, "and I've lived on this mountain my whole life. I know when the road wants to keep you and when it wants to throw you off." Carter let out a short, cynical laugh. "Right. Well, we have a four-wheel drive vehicle and an experienced driver. We don't need small-town advice." He turned back to Victoria. "I'll be in the car." "5 minutes, Victoria." He turned and strode out, slamming the door behind him. Victoria looked at Lucas, a look of quiet apology in her eyes. "I apologize for him. He's paid to worry about schedules, not people. People like him always worry about the destination," Lucas said, shifting slightly in his seat. "They miss the whole drive. It's an expensive way to live." Victoria stared at him. The depth of his words struck her. In her world of high-finance boardrooms and venture capitalism, everyone was obsessed with the destination, the metrics, the quarterly returns. No one ever talked about the drive. "What brought you to Oak Ridge?" Lucas asked, his tone polite but curious. "This isn't usually a tourist destination this time of year." Victoria hesitative. She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I'm hosting a charity gala tonight at the resort. The Sterling Education Initiative is funding several new school programs in the state." "That's a good thing," Lucas said. "Education changes everything." "It does," Victoria agreed. Her voice softened, dropping an octave. "But that's only the official reason I'm here." "And the unofficial one?" Lucas asked gently. Victoria looked toward the dark window, watching the snow lash against the glass. "I'm looking for someone. Someone I've been trying to find for a very long time." "A friend?" "A stranger," Victoria said, looking back at Lucas. "Someone who saved my life when I was 12 years old. Someone who gave me a future when I had absolutely nothing." Lucas looked at her, his quiet, dark eyes holding a deep stillness. He didn't pry. He had learned long ago that everyone carried locked rooms inside their hearts, and the worst thing you could do was try to force the door open. "I hope you find them," Lucas said. "I've followed every lead," Victoria whispered, almost to herself. "Every old record, every church ledger, every scholarship foundation that changed its name over the last 20 years. The trail brought me to this county. But it's like trying to find a single leaf in a forest." Lily, who had been quietly listening while drawing in her sketchbook, suddenly tapped Victoria's arm. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Victoria asked, turning her attention to the little girl. Lily proudly turned the sketchbook around. It was a pencil drawing of the diner. On one side, she had drawn a grand, glowing room filled with people in fancy clothes, but all the chairs were empty except for one at the very edge. Standing near that lonely chair was a woman in a long coat, her face turned away. At the top of the page, in shaky, uneven 9-year-old handwriting, Lily had written, "The lady with no table." Victoria felt a lump form in her throat. She stared at the drawing, her breath catching. The drawing was simple, but the emotional accuracy was devastating. She had spent the last decade of her life surrounded by thousands of people, praised by world leaders, applauded in crowded ballrooms. Yet she had always felt like that lonely woman standing at the edge of the room, with no table to call her own. "Why did you draw this?" Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. "I saw you on the news last night," Lily said softly, her eyes wide with a child's pure empathy. "There are lots of people clapping for you, but you looked like nobody was sitting with you. You looked sad." Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to suppress the sudden prickle of tears. A child she had met 20 minutes ago had seen through the entire multi-million-dollar PR campaign, the glossy profiles, and the billionaire armor. She had seen the lonely 12-year-old girl who was still hiding inside Victoria Sterling. "Children notice what adults spend their whole lives trying to edit out," Lucas said quietly. The sentence hung in the air, warm and heavy, defying the freezing storm outside. To understand why Victoria was sitting in a diner in the middle of a snowstorm, one had to look back 22 years. Before she was Victoria Sterling, the tech billionaire, she was simply Vicky, a terrified 12-year-old orphan living in the St. Agnes Children's Home in upstate New York. The facility was cold, underfunded, and drafty, with a roof that leaked every time it rained and radiators that clanged violently through the night. But physical discomfort was the least of her worries. Vicky was losing her sight. A degenerative corneal condition had begun to blur her vision. By the time she was 12, the chalkboard in her classroom had become a smear of gray light. The foster families who visited the home wanted healthy, perfect children. They didn't want a young girl who would require expensive surgeries and constant medical care. She was facing a future of absolute darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Then the miracle happened. An anonymous donor, operating through a small, struggling church scholarship fund, began paying for her treatments. It wasn't a massive, lump sum endowment. It was small, monthly payments that arrived like clockwork. Sometimes it was $40. Sometimes it was $18. Once, during a particularly cold winter, the payment was exactly $27.43, as if the donor had emptied their pockets of every single cent they had left after buying groceries and paying rent. Along with the money came letters. They were short, written on simple line paper in a neat, careful hand. They were never signed with a name, only 2 initials. "Elsie, you are not alone," one letter read. "Keep reading. The world will need what you see." Those words, and the medical procedures they funded, saved her. The surgery restored her vision, allowing her to study, to learn, to eventually build a technology empire focused on educational accessibility. She had built her entire life on the foundation of those anonymous letters. Now, sitting in the diner, Victoria reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed against the familiar texture of the old leather folder she carried everywhere. Inside were those 8 letters, 9 old receipts, and a single black-and-white newspaper clipping of her 12-year-old self, smiling shyly outside the children's home with thick medical glasses. She looked across the table at Lucas Cole. He was pouring a tiny bit of the remaining maple syrup onto Lily's last piece of pancake. He did it with a quiet, practiced precision, making sure she got every single drop. His flannel shirt was worn thin at the elbows, and his boots were salt-stained from the winter roads. "Elsie," Victoria's mind whispered. The thought brushed against her consciousness like a match near dry paper, but she immediately pushed it away. It was too impossible. It was too poetic. The man she had spent years searching for, the savior she had pictured in her mind, was always someone older, wealthier, perhaps a retired surgeon or a wealthy lawyer with a hidden philanthropic streak. It couldn't be this quiet, working-class man who rented a small apartment above the laundromat down the street and shared a single plate of pancakes with his daughter because money was too tight. "Daddy," Lily said, pulling a small, torn piece of paper from her pocket. She had folded it into the shape of a heart. She gently pushed it across the table toward Victoria, placing it right next to her coffee cup. "This is for you, so you have a heart to take with you to your big meeting." Victoria's breath hitched. She picked up the tiny paper heart, holding it between her fingers as if it were made of spun glass. "Thank you, Lily," Victoria said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is the most beautiful thing I've been given all year. My dad says that a small gift given with a warm heart is bigger than a big gift given just to be seen," Lily said proudly. Lucas cleared his throat, a slight flush of embarrassment rising on his neck. "Lily, I think our guest has had enough of my philosophy for one morning. Eat your breakfast, sweetie." "It's not just philosophy, Lucas," Victoria said, her eyes locked on his. "It's the truth. And it's a truth that a lot of people in my world have completely forgotten." Before Lucas could respond, the front door of the diner opened again. This time it wasn't Carter. Two local men, dressed in heavy work coats, walked in. They were shaking snow from their shoulders, their faces red from the freezing wind. One of them looked toward the back booth and stopped. "Lucas," the older of the two men called out. "You got a minute? The battery in my truck died down by the junction. I know you're off shift, but I was hoping you might have your jumper cables in the pickup." Lucas didn't hesitate. He immediately stood up, grabbing his worn canvas jacket from the back of the booth. "They're behind the seat, Frank," Lucas said, pulling his jacket on. "Let me grab them for you. The cold wreaks havoc on those old alternators." "Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'll pay you back as soon as." "Don't worry about it," Lucas said, cutting him off with a gentle wave of his hand. "Just pay it forward when the weather clears." As Lucas walked toward the door, Victoria watched him. He moved without drama, without the need for recognition or thanks. He was a man who lived his life in the service of small, quiet kindnesses. She looked down at the tiny paper heart in her hand, then at the blue tin box sitting on the table. The daisies painted on the lid were chipped, and a small, silver-locked clasp hung loose at the front. A sudden, overwhelming curiosity took hold of her. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, a magnetic pull toward that dented piece of metal. "Lily," Victoria said softly, leaning forward. "That's a very pretty box. What do you keep inside it?" Lily looked at the blue tin box, her eyes softening with a deep, reverent affection. "That's our memory box. It was my mommy's. But now it's where Daddy keeps the most important things in the world." "The most important things?" Victoria asked. "The letters," Lily whispered, leaning in as if sharing a grand secret. "The letters from the people we help. And the receipts. Daddy says we have to keep them safe. So when I grow up, I'll know that we always made room for other people, even when our own house was small." Victoria's heart began to hammer against her ribs. The diner seemed to fade away, the sounds of the wind and the clinking dishes dropping into a dull roar. The receipts. The letters. Before she could ask another question, the diner door opened, and Lucas returned, brushing snow from his shoulders. His face was pale from the cold, but his eyes were calm as he slid back into the booth. "The truck started," Lucas said, warming his hands over his coffee cup. "He should make it home before the roads freeze completely." "You're a good man, Lucas," Victoria said, her voice carrying a sudden intensity that made him pause. Lucas looked at her, his expression humble. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right by my daughter. There's no extraordinary goodness in that. It's just what you do." The quiet warmth of the diner was shattered 10 minutes later when Carter Hayes burst through the door for the third time. This time, he didn't stop at the entrance. He marched straight to the back booth, his face flushed with anger, his expensive leather gloves clenched into fists. Behind him, two local photographers, their heavy cameras hanging from their necks, stepped into the diner, shaking the snow from their lenses. "Enough is enough, Victoria," Carter snapped, his voice echoing off the metal panels of the diner. "The mayor's office is calling. The national media outlets are waiting at the resort. We have a schedule to keep, and you're sitting here playing charity with local laborers." The diner went dead silent. Mabel Finch stopped wiping the counter. The truck drivers turned around on their stools, their faces darkening. Otis, the elderly local, lowered his mug, his eyes narrowing at Carter. Victoria slowly rose from the booth. Her movements were calm, but there was a dangerous, icy edge to her posture that made Carter step back a fraction of an inch. "You will watch your tone, Carter," Victoria said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And you will not speak about the people in this room in that manner." "I'm doing my job," Carter defended himself, gesturing wildly toward the window. "Look outside. The press has tracked us here. We need to frame this. If you're going to be seen in a place like this, we need to make it look like a planned community outreach event. We need to control the narrative." He turned his attention to Lucas, his eyes dripping with corporate contempt. "And you," Carter said, pointing a gloved finger at Lucas. "What's your angle, mister? You see a billionaire sit at your table, and you think you've hit the jackpot, don't you? Let me guess, you've got a sob story. A sick kid, a foreclosure, a GoFundMe page? How much are you planning to ask her for?" "Carter," Victoria gasped, her face turning pale with shock and anger. "Stop this instantly." But Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't rise in anger. He didn't yell. He slowly folded his paper napkin, placed it neatly beside his empty plate, and looked up at Carter with a gaze so calm, so steady, that it made the sharp-tongued publicist freeze. "Everyone has a sad story, mister," Lucas said, his voice entirely devoid of heat. "But not everyone uses it to buy kindness. And not everyone who looks poor is trying to sell their pain." A low murmur of agreement passed through the diner. One of the truck drivers stood up, stepping closer to the back booth, his hands in his pockets, his presence a silent warning to Carter. "You don't need to explain yourself to him, Lucas," Mabel Finch called out from behind the counter, her voice trembling with protective rage. "We know who you are. This city slicker doesn't know anything." "I know how the world works," Carter sneered, trying to maintain his authority in the face of the hostile room. "People like him sit close to wealth and pretend to be humble, waiting for a handout. It's a classic script. I've seen it 1,000 times. My dad doesn't ask anyone for money." Lily suddenly cried out. Her small face was flushed red, tears shining in her eyes. She stood up in the booth, her mismatched mittens clenched into tiny fists. "He works 3 jobs. He pays for everything himself. He's the best man in the world, and you're mean." "Lily, sweetie, sit down," Lucas whispered, his hand gently covering her small fist, pulling her back to his side. "Let it go. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." "No, Duddy, it's not fair," Lily sobbed, her voice breaking. "He's telling lies about you. And Mom said that truth is for when the lies get too loud." Before Lucas could stop her, Lily slid out of the booth. Her small boots thudded against the floor as she ran toward the narrow hallway near the restrooms. "Lily, wait," Lucas called, half rising from his seat. "I'm getting the box." Lily screamed back, her voice echoing down the hall. "I'm going to show them." "Evelyn, no," Lucas muttered, looking toward Mabel with a sudden, deep panic in his eyes. The composure he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation seemed to crack, revealing a raw, vulnerable fear. "What box?" Carter asked, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a vulnerability. "What is she talking about?" No one answered. The diner waited in a tense, breathless silence. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside and the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the old clock above the counter. A minute passed. Then, the sound of small boots returning echoed down the hallway. Lily emerged, carrying the blue tin box with the painted daisies. She held it tightly against her chest with both arms, as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. She walked straight to the table and slammed it down on the laminate surface with a hollow, metallic clatter. "Lily, please," Lucas said, his voice carrying a pleading note that broke Victoria's heart. "That's private. We don't need to prove anything to these people." "Yes, we do, Daddy," Lily said, her tears finally overflowing, tracing wet paths down her cheeks. "He said you were pretending. You don't pretend." With shaking, determined fingers, Lily flipped the loose silver clasp of the box and threw the lid open. Inside the box were dozens of folded pieces of paper, old church bulletins, bank receipts, and a small stack of letters tied together with a faded piece of blue ribbon. At the very top of the pile lay a single, yellowed newspaper clipping. Victoria's eyes fell on the clipping, and the world came to a complete, shattering halt. She knew that photograph. She had a copy of it in her own pocket. It was the image of a 12-year-old girl with thick, black-rimmed glasses, smiling shyly outside the St. Agnes Children's Home. With trembling hands, Victoria reached out. Her fingers brushed the edge of the yellowed paper, lifting it from the box. She turned it over. Across the back, written in a neat, careful hand, were the words, "Vicky, keep reading. The world will need what you see." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted from the clipping to the stack of receipts underneath. She picked up the top receipt. It was a copy of a money order sent to the St. Agnes Scholarship Fund, dated December 14th, 22 years ago. The amount was $27.43. The donor's name, printed on the line, was Lucas Cole. Victoria looked up slowly, her vision blurring as tears finally spilled over her lashes. The billionaire who owned technology empires, who spoke to presidents and captains of industry, sat in a cracked vinyl booth, her hands shaking violently as she stared at the poor single father across from her. "It was you," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking under the immense weight of 22 years of unanswered questions. "It was you all along." Lucas looked at her. He didn't look proud. He didn't look like a man who had just won a prize. He looked deeply humbled, a quiet, gentle sadness in his eyes as he looked at the woman she had become. "It was never supposed to be about me, Victoria," Lucas said softly. "The money was just what we could spare. My wife, Sarah, she was the one who believed in you first. She saw your picture in the newsletter and said, 'This girl has a fire in her eyes. We can't let it go out.' After she passed, I just kept sending the envelopes. It felt like keeping a promise to her. And to you." Carter Hayes stood frozen beside the table, his mouth slightly open, the cynical words dying in his throat. The photographers slowly lowered their camera. The double doors of the ballroom swung open. A hush fell over the front of the room as Victoria Sterling walked in. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her, his hand holding hers tightly, was Lucas Cole. He still wore his flannel shirt and his worn canvas jacket, his work boots leaving faint, wet tracks on the plush carpet. On his other side was Lily, her green sweater slightly damp, her mismatched mittens tucked in her pockets, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at the sparkling chandeliers. The crowd stared. People lowered their glasses. Whispers began to ripple through the room like wind through dry grass. Who is that with her?" a donor in the front row murmured. Carter Hayes rushed over, his face tight with professional panic. "Victoria," he whispered, stepping between her and the crowd. "I've arranged a private table for Mr. Cole and his daughter in the VIP lounge. The press is—" "No, Carter," Victoria said, her voice clear, firm, and carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "They're sitting with me, at the head table. But the optics are exactly what they need to be," Victoria said, walking past them. She led Lucas and Lily to the very front of the room, pulling out the velvet-lined chairs for them herself. Lily sat down with a quiet gasp, her small fingers tracing the silver edge of the plate, while Lucas sat with his usual quiet dignity, looking entirely unfazed by the wealth surrounding him. The quartet finished their piece, and the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, inviting Victoria to the stage. The applause was polite, loud, and practiced as Victoria walked up the steps. She stood behind the podium, the warm spotlights shining down on her. Carter stood near the stage wings, holding his tablet, waiting for her to read the prepared speech. Victoria looked at the screen of the tablet, then slowly turned it face down on the podium. She looked out at the sea of wealthy faces, then let her eyes drift to the very front table, where Lucas and Lily sat. 22 years ago, Victoria began, her voice steady but carrying a deep, resonant emotion that immediately commanded the room's attention. I was a 12-year-old girl living in an orphanage in upstate New York. I was losing my sight. I had no family, no money, and no reason to believe that the world had any place for me. The room went completely quiet. The clinking of glasses stopped. But someone who didn't know me, someone who had never met me, decided that my future was worth saving. Victoria continued, her eyes shining under the lights. For years, they sent small monthly payments to fund my medical treatments and my education. Sometimes it was $40. Sometimes it was $18. They signed their letters only with the initials LC. She reached in her pocket and pulled out the old, faded letter she had carried for over 2 decades. She held it up for the entire ballroom to see. With every payment came a note, she said, her voice softening. You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see. For 22 years, I have searched for the person who wrote these words. I built this $20 billion foundation in the hope that I could live up to the legacy of that anonymous kindness. She paused, looking directly at Lucas. Tonight, in a small diner down the road, in the middle of a snowstorm, I found him, Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. His name is Lucas Cole. He is a single father, a lumber worker, and a man who has spent his entire life quietly saving others without ever asking for a single word of thanks or a single flash of a camera. The entire ballroom turned to look at Lucas. Lucas didn't stand up. He didn't wave. He simply sat with his arm around Lily, his eyes lowered, carrying himself with the same quiet, unshakable dignity he had possessed in the diner. We spend millions of dollars building monuments to our own charity, Victoria said, looking back at the crowd. We put our names on buildings, we host expensive galas, and we give to be seen. But the greatest charity in the world doesn't need a publicist. It doesn't need a boardroom. It only needs a heart that is willing to make room for someone else. She stepped away from the podium. The crowd waited, expecting her to walk to the back of the stage or invite Lucas up for a photo opportunity. But Victoria did neither. She walked down the steps of the stage, crossed the polished floor of the ballroom, and walked back to the front table. She stood in front of the empty chair next to Lucas, looking at him with a gaze full of deep, profound gratitude. Mind if I join you? Victoria asked softly, repeating the words that had started it all. Lucas looked up at her, a gentle, warm smile finally breaking across his weathered face. You already did, Victoria, Lucas said. Victoria sat down beside him, taking Lily's hand in her left hand and Lucas's rough, scarred hand in her right. In the wings of the stage, Carter Hayes slowly lowered his tablet, his face completely pale. The prepared speeches, the strategic branding, the corporate schedules, all of it felt suddenly insignificant, like dry leaves swept away by a sudden, powerful wind. Across the ballroom, a single donor stood up and began to clap. Then another stood. Within seconds, the entire room of billionaires, politicians, and socialites was standing, their applause rising to a deafening roar. Not for the Sterling Foundation, not for the expensive gala, but for the quiet, working-class father who had changed the world from the shadows and never once asked the world to turn on a light. 3 months later, the winter snow had begun to melt from the valleys of Oak Ridge, Vermont, giving way to the pale green shoots of early spring. On the corner of Maple Street, the old, abandoned brick schoolhouse had been completely transformed. The boarded-up windows had been replaced with wide, double-pane glass that led in the morning sun. A beautiful wooden sign hung over the main entrance, carved by hand from local oak, the Cole Light Center. The center was not named to glorify Lucas, but to honor the quiet philosophy he and his late wife had practiced for so many years. It offered free after-school tutoring, eye exams for children from low-income families, warm meals, and a quiet library where children could read for as long as they wanted without being rushed. On the opening day, the facility was bustling with local families. Children ran through the hallways, and the sound of laughter echoed off the freshly painted walls. Lucas Cole stood near the entrance, holding a stepladder. He was wearing his usual flannel shirt, busy adjusting a loose bracket on a light fixture near the doorway. He hadn't moved into a grand mansion. He hadn't stopped working his shifts. When a local reporter had asked him why he refused to accept the multi-million-dollar personal gifts Victoria had offered, Lucas had simply smiled and shaken his head. A bigger house doesn't make a man any bigger, Lucas had said. But a bigger table can feed a lot more people. Victoria funded the center. That's all the payment I'll ever need. Victoria Sterling stood near the front desk, watching him work. She looked different now. The exhausted, soul-weary look that had defined her face for years was entirely gone, replaced by a warm, grounded peace. She had spent the last 3 months in Oak Ridge, personally overseeing the center's launch, and for the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel like the lonely woman standing at the edge of the room. Lily ran past her, a box of art supplies in her hands, her mismatched mittens finally replaced with a warm, colorful pair Victoria had bought her. "Hey, Victoria," Lily called out, waving a drawing of a bright yellow sun. "Are you coming to the diner tonight? Mabel said she's making the blueberry pies." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Lily." Victoria laughed, her voice carrying a light, free sound that made Lucas look down from his ladder and smile. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floor of the center, Victoria walked over to the main entranceway. Mounted on the brick wall next to the door was a small, framed piece of paper. Written on it, in Lucas's neat, careful handwriting, was a simple message. Some people do not change the world by standing above it. They change it by saving one seat. And directly beneath it, written in Lily's small, uneven pencil strokes, were 3 words. "Mind if I join you?" Victoria touched the frame gently, her eyes reflecting the soft evening light. She had spent her entire life running, searching for a stranger who had given her a future, believing that she had to build empires to prove she was worthy of the gift. But in the end, she had learned that dignity didn't need to shout, grace didn't need a stage, and kindness, when given quietly, never truly disappeared. It simply traveled through the years, through the storms, through the hearts of strangers, until one day it returned as a miracle and pulled out a chair.